Hey everybody, Trey here. Welcome back to another forecast discussion as we have another severe weather event on tap for this weekend, starting as early as tomorrow night, going into most of the day on Saturday. That's going to be when the event will peak, and then possibly continuing into Sunday along the Eastern Seaboard. But again, the main threat, the peak of the system, will occur on Saturday. We do have a slight risk, level 2 out of 5 within the yellow area there, all the way from Memphis and Jackson, Tennessee, down to the southwest into East Texas, Houston, Lufkin, into Shreveport, Louisiana, Alexandria, Louisiana, the southern half of Arkansas, including Little Rock, and parts of western Mississippi under the gun for a severe threat there. Marginal risk level 1 out of 5 surrounds that large slight risk area. So that is going to be our main focus for this video. I'm going to try to keep this brief as just quite frankly, there's not a lot to talk about. This system does not look all that potent, but we've had some interesting changes in the models over the past few days that I thought would be good to detail in a video here. And we'll just go over some of the model data, see how the event may play out as far as the threats for certain areas. We do have a severe threat for Friday night. It is a marginal risk level 1 out of 5 for eastern Oklahoma, northeast Texas, into much of Arkansas. That threat is going to be very, very isolated, mostly with isolated elevated convection with a marginal severe hail threat. Again, Friday night into early Saturday morning. Surface-based development in the warm sector is unlikely on Friday night into Saturday morning, and the main threat again will be on Saturday, going into Sunday possibly across the Eastern Seaboard. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Let's dive right into our mesoanalysis data here. This is our 500 millibar map at present. Not a ton going on at the moment. We do have a little bit of ridging across the central portion of the country, and just some general troughiness making its way into the western portion of the U.S. From this general troughiness is going to come our main trough, our main synoptic scale forcing mechanism for our severe weather event on Saturday. Here we have a little bit of a lead shortwave making its way across the Rockies as we speak. That will initiate a surface low that will move off into the Great Lakes region and southern Canada, going into the day today into tomorrow. And then behind that is going to be our trough that will start to dig down into the southern portion of the country, and that will be our main player. We'll look at some model data here in a second, but that's going to be our main player for at least a synoptic scale forcing for ascent in this regime. As you might expect, we've had a little bit of stronger flow, westerly flow traversing the Rockies already, so we should have some semblance of surface low development here across just on the east side of the Rockies, and that's exactly what has gone on. Very broad, kind of multi-centered surface low here. We have a little bit of a center possibly here across western Kansas, a couple different possible centers here out across the northern high plains up into Montana and southern Canada. That is going to be a broad surface low that will consolidate and strengthen as we go through the day today, and again move off to the east or northeast into the Great Lakes vicinity going through the day today into tomorrow. 850 millibar map as far as our low-level jet goes. Not a ton going on right now. We do have a little bit of a shortwave associated with that incoming upper-level trough. A little bit of a fetch of low-level flow, strengthened low-level flow, 40 to 45 knots here across Kansas, Oklahoma into Texas out of the southwest. That should continue a little bit as we get that surface low to consolidate across the northern plains today, and that will start this process of bringing the moisture northward. It has been shunted well off into the Gulf. Let's take a look at our surface data here, and I'll refresh this so we have our most up-to-date data. But you see our 60s dew points are very much confined to this very southern portion of Texas, mostly 30s to 40s dew points from Oklahoma southward into Texas, Louisiana, into Arkansas. So our moisture well off into the Gulf at this point and far into southern Texas. So it's going to take quite a bit to get this moisture northward, but we should get that done. Again, we have this initial wave, initial surface low that will develop, that is developing here across the northern plains that will help to strengthen that low-level flow and start to initially bring that moisture out of the south. And then once we get our secondary trough to come in, we'll get another robust low-level, we should get another sort of low-level response to help bring that moisture northward and have a solid warm sector for severe weather development on Saturday. All right, let's look at some model data. This is the 12Z NAM, hot off the press from this morning. We're just going to look at the 12Z NAM for this video. The models are showing a very similar solution among them as far as location and timing of the overall features. So we're just going to look at the 12Z NAM for simplicity's sake for this video. We'll start out at 500 millibars as we always do, and you can see the ridge across the central portion of the country and the general troughiness here across the western half of the country. The main reason why this overall severe setup has downtrended somewhat from a few days ago is trough geometry. And I'll explain what I mean by that here as we go through this data. So watch what happens here. So this is the 12Z NAM 500 millibars. You see that initial shortwave making its way off into the northern portion of the country, moving off into the Great Lakes region. Not going to be of interest for our severe weather threat on Saturday, but you see this belt of stronger flow making its way into the western half of the country come Friday. That is going to be our main player. That is going to be a trough, developing trough that will start to dig down into the southern portion of the country come Friday evening into Saturday. But look what happens as far as the geometry of this trough. It is very much a positively tilted trough, very much leaning, that axis of the trough leaning toward the right. We've talked about trough geometry a lot, or trough tilt a lot, in our last several videos on this channel. Trough tilt just involves which way the axis of the trough tilts. If you were to draw a line through the main kinks associated with the overall trough, that is your axis of the trough. If it tilts toward the right, it's a positively tilted trough. And if it tilts toward the left, it's a negatively tilted trough. And positively tilted troughs tend to mean that your trough is still in a maturing phase. It's not quite as strong as a negatively tilted trough. A negatively tilted trough tends to feature a little bit better ingredients for severe weather and a stronger low-level response, which tends to mean more moisture return, more low-level shear, more deep layer shear, more instability for a more robust severe weather threat. Now watch what's happened with the trough as far as our model progs over the last several runs. We're going to use the GFSs. This was what I posted about this on social media last night, and I used the GFS model for our comparison. And just looking at the last several runs of the GFS, valid for 6 p.m. Central Standard Time on Saturday evening. And this is what the 500 millibar pattern looked like at that time. This is the 12Z GFS on the 0Z GFS on December 5th. So 6 p.m. Central Time run on December 4th. And here's our trough right here. And you can see it's somewhat of a neutrally to slightly negatively tilted little shortwave there embedded within the flow. And that would indicate somewhat of a more robust severe weather threat with that kind of a trough. But watch what happens to the trough over the next several runs. We start to see a slow unwinding, if you will, of this trough. And it turns into a much more strung out, much more positively tilted trough. This was the 18Z run from yesterday afternoon. Very much a positively tilted, more strung out kind of trough, and that's what we're seeing with the model runs at this point right now. This is, again, our 12Z NAM from this morning's run, so the freshest model run we have, and it is looking like a very strung out, very positively tilted trough. That, again, has implications on the low-level response. With a stronger, more negatively tilted upper-level trough, we have a more robust low-level response. In other words, that means a stronger surface low and a more robust northward advance of the warm sector, or more robust moisture return. And you can see that exactly here. This is the same progression of the GFS model that we saw for our 500 millibar progs, but this time we're looking at the surface. So again, we're starting off with our 0Z run on December 5th, so 6 p.m. Central Time run on December 4th, 3 days ago as of the recording of this video. Correlating with that stronger, more negatively tilted upper level trough, we have a more robust low-level response. In other words, a stronger surface low here, more tightly wound surface low there centered across Illinois, and a stronger, more robust northward advance of the warm sector. You see those yellows and oranges, those warmer temperatures up there, indicative of a really intense northward moisture return, strong flow in the warm sector. So that warm sector was going to be very widespread and very much situated off to the north as well, perhaps bringing a severe threat all the way up here into the Midwest with this particular solution. Cold front here draped down to the southwest as well. We'll talk about the cold front here in just a little bit, as that is going to be a main feature for our severe threat on Saturday. But this is what it looked like a few days ago. And with this solution, we would see likely a robust severe weather threat. But watch what happens with the surface pattern over the next several runs. We start to see a slow unwinding of that surface low. It becomes much less focused. That warm sector, that northward moisture return, that northward advance of the warm sector becomes much less focused, much more strung out. The surface low all the way up here into southeast Canada, associated with a little shortwave within that broader 500 millibar trough. Let me go back there to our solution. You see the little bit of a shortwave here in the main flow, but our overall trough remains very much positively tilted. So that is why our surface low is all the way up here into southeast Canada, with not much of a response here into the U.S. You see a very loose surface pattern, if you will. Cold front still draped down to the south from the northern surface low, but we don't really have a focused surface low here across the Midwest or across the Mississippi River Valley that we would like to see for a really robust severe threat across the Gulf Coast states and the Deep South. Still, warm sector does make itself does show itself here across the Gulf Coast states. But again, it's just a very unfocused surface response, unlike what we saw a few days ago, which would be associated with a more robust severe threat. Now we're seeing the models have really downtrended on that. That is due mostly to that more strung out, positively tilted upper level trough that we're seeing. And that is leading to a less robust low-level response, less robust low-level moisture return, and therefore a severe weather event that is not likely to be as intense as it was initially forecast to be. Speaking of the current run of the NAM, you see that strung out trough there, positively tilted trough. And again, the low-level response is going to be very unfocused with this. We'll take a look at our surface low, or surface pattern here. You do see that surface low up there in the Great Lakes region, cold front draped down to the south, and very strung out, not really a focused surface low there. So the current run of the NAM is very much showing what we saw with last night's runs, a much less focused low-level response. As far as moisture return goes, let's take a look at our moisture return. So I'm going to zoom in here to our Southern Plains sector. So you can see that moisture still confined there to the far southern tip of Texas, pushed well off into the Gulf thanks to our latest cold frontal passage. So that moisture has been swept into the Gulf. We're going to need a few days of that stronger southerly flow to help pull that moisture northward. And we're going to get that because we do have that initial surface low that we talked about here, our lead little shortwave lead surface low going to develop, help to make the winds across the plains strengthen and back out of the south to really start pulling that moisture northward slowly here today into tomorrow for Saturday's severe weather threat. So let's look at the moisture. You see throughout the day today, it starts to slowly make its way northward. By this evening, we start to see 60s into central Texas. Overnight into tomorrow, those 60s make its way up to the Red River, at least in this model run here. And that warm sector somewhere in the eastern Oklahoma, northeast Texas, to Arkansas vicinity tomorrow. We do again have a marginal risk out for tomorrow evening, Friday evening into early Saturday morning. Again, mostly going to be elevated storms as we're going to see a fairly capped air mass here across the warm sector, but we could see a few elevated storms here. Let's take a sounding right from the Texarkana area, just kind of in the middle of the warm sector there. So surface-based development Friday night into Saturday morning is going to be very, very limited, if any at all, because of some capping inversions here. The NAM is showing somewhat of an uncapped atmosphere, and we'll have to watch this for a potential solution. The overall forcing in the warm sector is going to be a little bit on the minimal side. We won't see really that trough making its way in. You see just a glancing blow here, not really a focused synoptic scale forcing for ascent for the Friday night, Saturday morning portion of the severe weather threat. But we will have to watch to see maybe if we can get a surface-based storm or two, then we would see a greater severe threat than what is currently forecast. But right now, that is looking like an unlikelihood for the Friday night, Saturday morning portion of this event. But you can see the profiles here. Decent instability, decent low-level and deep layer shear for supercells. So if we do see surface-based storms Friday night into Saturday morning, we'll probably see an increase in the overall severe threat here with perhaps an all-hazards threat on the table. But for now, it looks like mostly elevated storms and that the NAM might be a little bit of an outlier here, as we could see a little bit of a capping inversion is what some of the other models are showing across the warm sector there, meaning more elevated storms and more of an isolated, marginally severe hail threat for Friday night into Saturday morning across parts of eastern Oklahoma, northeast Texas, into much of Arkansas, perhaps far northwest Louisiana. But again, our main event is going to come on Saturday, as this warm sector makes its way northward. You'll see the continued push of moisture northward. But again, it's somewhat displaced from the surface low that we saw that is situated up in the Great Lakes. That surface low, we're going to see that cold front draped from it. But if we had a surface low somewhere in here, somewhere across the Midwest, we'd see a much more robust response as we saw on those earlier model runs. Much more robust low-level response would be a much greater severe threat. But here, our low-level forcing, surface low, located well off to the north away from the warm sector. So we're going to have to rely on the cold front to really initiate storms in this environment. You can see it's very much a slanted cold front, northeast to southwest oriented cold front. And oftentimes that really means at first glance, that generally means when you have westerly or southwesterly flow aloft, your shear vector is going to be very much parallel to the cold front, and therefore your storm mode may be a little bit more on the messy side. Let's take a look at that right now just real quickly. Let's take a look at our shear vectors here. We'll take a look at our Moocape plot on COD as that shows the overall deep layer shear vectors, and you can see they are very much almost perfectly parallel to the cold front. That indicates a very quick transition to a more linear clustered mode that is likely with this setup. So this is most likely going to be a squall line type of event with our severe weather coming from the squall line itself. Chances for overall warm sector convection. The warm sector is not all that wide, so we don't have a lot of real estate for isolated supercells ahead of the line to develop. But again, that is always something we have to watch for in these types of events. If we see any little confluence bands in the open warm sector, which we don't really see much of here looking at our 850 millibar streamlines. Our surface map, don't really see any confluence bands here in the open warm sector. Our cold front looks to be our main forcing mechanism for ascent here, at least on the mesoscale for this environment. And again, our cold front, our shear vector is very much parallel to the cold front, meaning a very much linear to clustered mode here. So it's going to be more of a, looks like more of a damaging wind, perhaps embedded spin-up tornado threat, not going to be a significant long track tornado threat or anything to deal with, which is some good news for the folks in these areas, as we were just under the gun a couple weeks ago on November 20th with a similar threat, although the threat was more robust with that event. Not the case here. Looks like a more of just a solid squall line that is going to be our main severe weather maker with this setup. Now we have our classic dichotomy here. Farther to the north, stronger low-level shear. And let's look at that. Our 850 millibar map will show that here. Well, I'm going to zoom back out. So you see our low-level jet focused where that shortwave is farther to the north across the Great Lakes. We do have a trailing segment of that low-level jet down into the southeast. But so with southern extent closer to the East Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas vicinity, less low-level flow, less intense low-level flow, meaning our low-level photographs going to be fairly minimal. So our tornado threat going to be fairly minimal here back to the southwest. With southwest extent, low-level shear weakens. With northward extent, our low-level shear increases. A little bit of a plume of low-level jet there here Saturday afternoon across the Mississippi River Valley, southeast Arkansas, northeast Louisiana, western Mississippi, into southwest Tennessee. So that could mean a greater tornado threat farther to the north, but instability farther to the north is going to be less than it is farther to the south, closer to our moisture source. So we have that classic dichotomy with these cool season severe weather events. Northward portions of the risk area are going to have greater shear. So greater shear up here, less instability. So lower Cape, higher shear up here to the north, higher Cape, lower shear here to the south. So down here means more of a perhaps large hail damaging wind threat, large hail especially in the earlier portions of the convective life cycle. But again, mostly a quick transition to a linear mode with this setup. So the damaging wind threat should take over fairly quickly. Up here to the north, perhaps a greater threat for a few spin-up tornadoes, but again, they're going to be embedded in the line, number one, so they will be more of your brief embedded spin-up tornado types rather than your significant long-track tornadoes that we might see with more discrete storm modes. But your instability is a lot weaker up here, so the robustness of the updrafts might be on the weaker side up here. But again, in these high shear events, it doesn't take a whole lot to get little spin-ups in these convective lines. So the good news, again, just to sum things up, the good news is that we should see more of a clustered to linear storm mode, meaning that the damaging wind threat is going to be the main threat. And the long track, that will negate the long track significant tornado threat, meaning that we'll just see perhaps a few brief spin-up tornadoes within the line, nothing on the long track significant tornado side of things, which is some great news for the folks in these areas. So again, this is 3 p.m. Central Time on Saturday. Let's take a few soundings here from across the warm sector. We'll take one up here to the north near the Memphis area, Memphis, Tennessee. And we'll take one down here to the south in western Louisiana, just to see the overall distribution of the profiles within the warm sector. So this is farther to the north. You can see very skinny instability, just about 1,000 joules per kilogram of mixed layer Cape, but very much on the skinny side, weaker low-level lapse rates, the change in the temperature with height in the low levels of the atmosphere on the weaker side, still adequate for some stronger updrafts, and low-level shear definitely adequate for a tornado or two within the line. You can see over 200 meters squared per second squared effective storm relative felicity, decent curvature in the low levels of the hodograph, certainly favorable for a few spin-up tornadoes within the line. Farther to the south, you can see that dichotomy that we were talking about. Stronger instability, 1,300 to 1,400 joules per kilogram of mixed layer Cape, a little bit fatter instability there, a little bit more robust thermodynamics, but our low-level shear much weaker than it is farther to the north. Not a ton of curvature here in the low levels of the hodograph, much straighter hodographs overall. Still strong deep layer shear for rotation within the line, perhaps some embedded supercells within the overall squall line. But again, the damaging wind threat will be most notable down here. The tornado threat will be a little bit less with southwest extent, and if we can get more discrete supercells to fire initially along the cold front, we will see a large hail threat given stronger instability, weaker low-level shear in that environment farther to the southwest. Let's move on here, 0Z, as that cold front will continue to surge off to the east. Again, that is another factor that will allow for the congealing of the storms into a line pretty quickly. Pretty surgy cold front here as we move into Saturday evening, late Saturday night. That cold front will really surge off to the southeast, and that will allow things to congeal into a line even further. So again, the storm mode here is going to keep the long track significant tornado threat at bay, which is some good news for the folks in these areas. Here we are at 0Z, 6 p.m. Central Time. We'll take a couple more soundings here across the warm sector ahead of the cold front. This is farther to the north, certainly a favorable profile for a few spin-up tornadoes within the line. Adequate instability for a robust updraft, still a little on the skinny side, but that low-level shear certainly looks pretty favorable for some tornadoes within the line. Again, going to be spin-up tornadoes, not really a strong tornado type of setup, but spin-up tornadoes certainly a threat along the squall line here. Farther to the south, pretty much the same, less low-level shear to deal with, instability much of the same here. So throughout the warm sector, it does look like we could see a fairly uniform threat with a little bit greater tornado threat here farther to the north, but mostly a damaging wind threat with maybe a large hail threat earlier on in the convective life cycle as the storms initiate along the cold front before turning into more of a damaging wind threat along the squall line as we go into the evening hours. So that's going to wrap things up for this video. Just wanted to do a quick sort of outline of what we might see for the next couple of days. Might be back with a video on Saturday morning if the threat warrants, but again, it doesn't look like all that robust a threat. Definitely different from what we were seeing on our November 20th event, our last robust severe threat across the Deep South, where we were looking at a significant long-track tornado threat. Didn't end up materializing, but certainly some of the ingredients looked much more favorable with that setup for significant tornadoes than it does with this setup. So again, we have a marginal risk level 1 of 5 for Friday night into early Saturday morning across eastern Oklahoma, northeast Texas, into much of western Arkansas. That is going to be looking to be on the marginal side because of the elevated nature of the storms. Mostly an isolated, marginally severe hail threat with the storms. We will have to watch if we can get some more surface-based instability in play, as what the NAM potentially is showing. Then we could see a greater severe threat develop, more of an all-hazards threat. But for now, it looks like the NAM is a little bit of an outlier, and we might see just more spotty, elevated convection with a tendency for mostly subsevere, but perhaps some marginally severe hail, instances of marginally severe hail in there Friday night into Saturday morning across the dark green area there. Then we move into Saturday, when we will see our severe threat maximize. Slight risk level 2 out of 5 from western Tennessee down to the southwest, southern Arkansas, western Mississippi, much of Louisiana, and east Texas. That is going to be an all hazards threat. Again, farther to the north in the risk area here, greater threat for a few tornadoes. Again, they're going to be embedded within the line, more your spin-up tornado variety. Nothing really screaming significant long-track tornadoes with this setup. Here to the north, that low-level shear is stronger, while instability might be a little bit on the weaker side up there. But again, in these strongly sheared events, you don't really need a ton of instability to get rotating elements within the line. And therefore, our tornado threat might be a little bit greater up here farther to the north, whereas with southwest extent, low-level shear decreases, but instability increases. So in the early going, as storms fire on the cold front as it moves off to the southeast, we might see a few storms fire up there as they stay discrete, perhaps a chance for some larger hail, but then with shear vectors pretty much parallel to the surging cold front, we should see a quick transition to a linear, more clustered mode, and therefore a transition to damaging wind and maybe a few embedded tornadoes, but again, that threat is going to be greater with northeast extent here. So we'll have some more probabilistic updates here with the SPC over the coming days. Our day 2 outlook will give us the tornado, hail, and wind threats, but for now, just a broad severe risk here within the slight risk area. Again, doesn't look like a super intense severe weather threat, given the storm mode will be unfavorable for significant long-track tornadoes and large hail. So mostly just going to be pretty much a solid squall line, perhaps some embedded supercells with a tornado threat, but mostly just a solid squall line with a damaging wind threat moving through the deep south into the southeast. And then on Sunday, we don't have a legitimate severe risk area outlined yet, but that threat could continue into Sunday across the Eastern Seaboard, southern Georgia, up through the Carolinas, through the Delmarva area. As that trough moves off to the east, the trough will take on eventually a more negative tilt As it transitions into the east coast, you'll see here that trough really starts to swing through, take on a more neutral tilt by Sunday afternoon and evening. But by then, the instability should be pretty minimal, should be shunted off the east coast, and therefore it's going to all depend on the instability. We see a little bit more robust instability through the eastern seaboard states. On Sunday, we'll see a more robust severe threat, but the SPC is yet to outline a severe threat there. Could see just a continuation of the squall line, perhaps some damaging winds, embedded tornado or two, but nothing too intense at the moment. We'll see how SPC handles that going forward. But right now, this is the main risk appears to be on Saturday in the slight risk area, the yellow area there from the East Texas into the deep south and the Mississippi River Valley area. So with that, thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.